Hey everyone, it's Brian Varnell with Varnell Retro and Vintage Collections, and I want to welcome everyone to episode 1 of my new podcast series where I'll be talking about everything James Bond Jr. I am super excited to start this podcast series because James Bond Jr. has been a huge part of my life in one way or another. I remember watching the cartoon show as a kid, and I had many of the action figures. I was a huge James Bond fan, so having a cartoon show called James Bond Jr. around immediately piqued my interest. Also, I filmed a movie with friends in middle school, and it was James Bond Jr. Now, it was loosely based on some of the characters and whatnot, but still, a huge part of my life. So before I get ahead of myself, for those who might not know who James Bond Jr. is or what it is, James Bond Jr. was an animated series that ran for one season, 65 episodes. That's impressive. 65 episodes for one season. The title character was James Bond Jr., who was the nephew to James Bond. I know that it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but, it made sense for the show. The show was produced by MGM, and the Broccolis were behind it. So you had a lot of the characters from the James Bond universe kind of come over to James Bond Jr., and also they created some family members of characters. So alongside James Bond Jr., you had Horace IQ Boothrow III, who was the grandson of Q, 007's Gadget Man. You had Gordo Leiter, who was the son of Felix Leiter, James Bond's CIA friend. There was a character named Tracy Milbanks, who was the daughter of the headmaster that all these kids went to school in. Because these were like, I don't know. I guess they were supposed to be like high schoolers, I think. It never really kind of says what grade they're in or what kind of education this is, but Tracy Milbanks was the daughter of the headmaster, but then, of course, for those who know the James Bond lore, Tracy is the name of James Bond's murdered wife. Tracy Bond. You had a lot of characters who had connections to the James Bond universe, and then also went to the villain side. You had a lot of the villains who were based off of villains from the films. One of the biggest one was Jaws. Jaws was in this show, but unlike Jaws in the movie where he just had the metal teeth, this Jaws, his whole jaw was pretty much just made of iron. And so that's really cool. Nick Nack was a villain on the show. Nick Nack was the henchman to the man with the golden gun. You had Goldfinger was on the show, and alongside Goldfinger was his daughter Goldie Finger, so there's a little bit of a comedic twist on the name. And of course, if you have Goldfinger, you have Oddjob. Oddjob looked very different in this variation of the character. He had like a gold chain, and he wore a tracksuit, and he had these really thick aviator glasses, but he still had the hat that he threw, so that they kept that. Another character they brought over from James Bond universe was Dr. No. Dr. No was in this series, and he had the ability to change his hands, which, if you know who Dr. No is, he didn't have any hands. So they took a lot of characters from who already existed in James Bond and kind of revamped them and changed them for James Bond Jr., which is cool. But yeah, so the show ran for one season, and actually this year marks the 30th anniversary of when James Bond Jr. first aired. James Bond Jr. first aired on September 30th, 1991. It ran from that date to March 2nd of 92. So yeah, 30 years. Wow. That's pretty amazing. And what's interesting about this cartoon show, that lasted one season, it had a lot of merchandise and a lot of big name companies that were making products. Hasbro distributed the action figures for the show, and the action figures were really cool. They were really elaborate. Like I said, the Dr. No, he can change out his hands. Well, the action figure had the ability of swapping out one of his hands for other accessories, which nowadays you see that all the time with action figures, where you can switch out hands and heads and whatever. So that was pretty innovative. And even the way some of the action figures, how they moved. One could go underwater. One had a functioning parachute that you could use. It was definitely something when you compare it to a lot of other 90s toys. I love the Ninja Turtle action figures, and they're really cool, but a majority of the Ninja Turtle action figures were just the turtles with their weapons. Occasionally you would have some that could, spit out water and whatnot, but for the most part, they didn't do anything except for holding a weapon, and that was it. But with James Bond Jr., Oddjob can throw his hat. He can physically throw his hat. Dr. No can change his hands. He has a grip. Jaws can open his mouth and close it. So these toys were, really elaborate, and honestly, I would say some of the best toys in the 90s that don't really get talked about. But outside of the toy line, that was distributed by Hasbro, you had vehicles also that went with the action figures. Of course, if you're going to have figurines, you're going to have vehicles for them to go in. So you had that. Several of the episodes came out on VHS here in the US and in UK. And also, I think it's really huge, Marvel ran a 12-issue comic book series on James Bond Jr. If Marvel Comics is willing to say, hey, we'll distribute some comics, they must have thought there was something to it. And what's interesting about that is that the first, and I'll explain more about the comics in later episodes, but just kind of a quick overview, issue 1 through 5 were straight adaptations of episodes. But following that, 6 through 12, they were all original stories. And who wrote those stories was one of the co-creators of Guardians of the Galaxy. So that's pretty amazing. There's a lot of people who were attached to James Bond Jr. who also did things in pop culture that are really, really, really cool. Like the composer of James Bond Jr. composed the Ninja Turtle theme. Corey Burton, who voices James Bond Jr., he also voiced Brainiac in the Superman animated series. He's the Grindhouse trailer narrator. And most recently, he's the voice of Dooku on Clone Wars. You had Jeff Burnett, who plays IQ. He's been on countless animated programs like Dexter's Laboratory. He was the dad on Dexter's Laboratory. There's a lot of interesting pop culture connections that revolve around the people who were involved with James Bond Jr. Coincidentally, I actually had a chance to interview Corey Burton years ago in college, and we talked a little bit about James Bond Jr., so that was really fun. That's kind of a quick, who is James Bond Jr., what is it? I'll go more in depth as the episodes go on. What I'm going to do is rewatch, all 65 episodes, and then I'll review the episodes, give my thoughts, and if there's a comic that is an adaptation of that episode, I'll be talking about that as well. And then once I get to the comics and were original stories, then I'll just do a whole kind of episode, give my thoughts about that. But yeah, so that's just kind of a quick introduction to the podcast. I'm really excited to get this started. If you want to check out some of the James Bond Jr. merchandise that I own, including the action figures, the comic books, VHS tapes, check out my Instagram at Varnell Retro Vintage Collections. You can also check out photos of other random things here in my office. So yeah, well, thank you for tuning in to this first episode. I'll be posting the next one where I'll be talking about episode 1 of James Bond Jr., The Beginning. Again, I'm Brian Varnell with Varnell Retro Vintage Collections, and remember, danger lurks within every shadow.